My parents insisted my sister walk down the aisle first at my wedding. We tricked them and hired security to keep her out. Chaos ensued. Here I am, composing this extensive narrative during my honeymoon, yet it is incredibly cathartic to finally express it, and my husband is more thrilled about this than the resort's beverages. This is a throwaway account as I do not have a Reddit profile, and my husband, an avid Reddit user, preferred that this not be linked to his main account. You might wonder why the Reddit enthusiast isn't the one sharing this. He mentioned, "Since it involves my family, I should be the one honored with sharing this tale." But he is closely monitoring my progress to provide assistance. I am not an attorney, so I cannot ascertain the legality of this situation, but I do not authorize the reposting of this narrative in any other locations. First, I deem it essential to provide some context to clarify how this behavior escalated to the current situation and why we reacted as we did. I apologize for the lengthy read. From my earliest memories, my parents consistently favored my sister over me. This wasn't subtle favoritism, either. If my sister accused me of something, they promptly believed her and punished me. Conversely, if I claimed she did something wrong, my accusations were disregarded. Even with irrefutable evidence, my sister would receive a lighter sentence, while they would attempt to find a way to reprimand me simultaneously. My birthday cake had to be her preferred flavor, while mine did not matter. Whenever she expressed a dislike for something, my parents claimed ignorance about my distaste for that specific cake. They always bought her a bit more than they purchased for me. We vacationed at her chosen locations, even when the trip was intended to celebrate me. My sister grew up indulged and treated me poorly, often using me as an outlet for her frustrations. Initially, she mostly ignored me, but as we transitioned into our teenage years, the situation drastically worsened. I'm not entirely certain what caused the shift, but she found herself friendless and her behavior deteriorated. Did her friends move away, or did they distance themselves due to her unkindness? I cannot say, as we were never close, and my parents loved to brag about her accomplishments but would never mention any of her difficulties. In contrast, they were quick to highlight my flaws as teasing material. All I knew was that she had no company, as we attended the same school and I observed her solitude. So she became friendless while I had a social circle. I enjoyed a decent level of popularity. Upon realizing this, my sister transformed me from her occasional punching bag into a target she felt compelled to dismantle. She began making more accusations about me. She even targeted my friends with her vendettas. My parents prohibited me from spending time with anyone, providing excuses that varied from, "They're bad influences according to your sister," to, "Why are you trying to separate yourself from us? Can't you appreciate family time like your sister does?" What brought me some respite from total loneliness was support from my extended family. Much of my relatives lived nearby, and I got along well with my cousins, despite some age differences. At one gathering, they invited me to an event. I cannot recall the specifics, and when I regretfully replied that I was not permitted to go anywhere, my young self, lacking a filter, stated it was because my sister had no friends. That revelation reached the adults and apparently caused considerable turmoil for my parents. Later, I was reprimanded for lying and grounded for a month, as if I had anywhere to go. However, afterward, my parents allowed me some breathing room, which was invaluable. Soon after, my sister switched schools. Perhaps the embarrassment of our extended family knowing her social standing compelled her to request a transfer. My parents promptly complied, despite the additional costs incurred because the new school was farther away. While she made friends at her new school, she never returned to the previous state of mostly ignoring me. Having discovered the power of tormenting me coupled with her resentment over others hearing that she lacked friends, she clung to me even more. My existence remained challenging. Her friends often visited and bullied me, while my parents brushed it off as mere teasing. I avoided inviting friends over because my parents were terrible hosts, and if my sister accused them of taking anything, they would automatically side with her. However, I developed a close bond with my cousins, as my parents dared not act that way with family. Eventually, I began dating for the first time. Although I was hesitant about bringing him home, my parents were insistent. One day, during a separation, he sought me out to inform me that my sister was flirting with him. By flirting, I mean she approached him in revealing attire, fluttering her eyelashes awkwardly while criticizing me and lauding herself. Naturally, my sister provided a different version of events to my parents, claiming that my boyfriend had attempted to flirt with her, graciously rejecting him out of loyalty to me. Guess who my parents chose to believe? While my boyfriend had his flaws, I immediately sided with him. For a spiteful reason. Remember, I was a teenager too, suffering from pronounced unfair treatment. I was resentful and moody, bearing the same hatred for my sister that she held for me. With that context in mind, let's discuss appearances. I had held off on mentioning them as they weren't initially relevant. My parents were, and still are, overweight. Since they expressed love through food by providing extra servings, purchasing treats, etc. My sister was also overweight, while I was not, in fact. I have always been somewhat thin, as punishments often included deprivation of snacks. Of course, weight isn't the pivotal issue. Personality is what truly matters. However, even at an insecure adolescent stage, I held no belief that my boyfriend would ever consider cheating on me with her, given her spoiled and rude nature. In any case, my parents forbade me from dating such an unsuitable guy. I attempted to maintain the relationship in secret, but it proved challenging, culminating in its end. I eventually met another guy, but once again, my sister accused him of trying to flirt with her when he turned down her advances. Shockingly, my parents took her word for it. I pointed out the recurring pattern, yet they concluded that my repeated troubles resulted from my inability to choose suitable partners. The romance could not withstand the Romeo and Juliet narrative and quickly dwindled. I was later branded a promiscuous girl in high school due to my comfort with kissing boys, but refusal to engage in relationships. Thankfully, this reputation never surfaced with my sister or parents. My sister did bring a boyfriend home during this period. He was showcased with pride, and my parents spent every second applauding him while lamenting why I couldn't be more like my sister and find someone of such stature. Until he disappeared, leading my parents to label him a duplicitous scoundrel who deceived her. Oh well. The unfair treatment endured during this time. She received more spending money, her curfews were much more lenient than mine, and she had the freedom to go out when she pleased, whereas I did not have that liberty. When I raised these discrepancies, my parents argued it was due to her being older. Yet, when I reached that age, I still experienced a lack of the same privileges she enjoyed, and whenever I broached the topic, they would either deny having said that or assert it was because I lacked the trustworthiness that she possessed, citing my sister's accusations against my boyfriend and friends as proof of my poor judgment. Time passed, and as my sister prepared to graduate, she received acceptance from a college. It wasn't a well-regarded institution, and there were no scholarships involved. Once again, only her accomplishments were showcased to me, so I couldn't even determine which colleges she considered or how harshly she might have been rejected. I was aware, however, that her academic performance was subpar because any time she received a B, we celebrated. I typically achieved good grades, but my parents never celebrated my success, claiming there was nothing to celebrate since I consistently performed well. Naturally, my parents made a huge deal out of her college acceptance, promising to cover all expenses. I felt relieved that she would be moving away. However, that didn't alleviate my circumstances. She returned home every other weekend, somehow creating chaos like missing items from my room or contriving new issues to disturb my life. My curfews restricted me as before. Eventually, my mom approached me regarding my upcoming graduation. I am only a year younger than my sister. She informed me that since they were covering my sister's college expenses, they couldn't financially support mine. Therefore, it would be more beneficial for me to work directly after graduation and wait until my sister completed university to see if they could afford to assist me. Additionally, if I chose to stay at home, I would be responsible for paying for my expenses, including bills and rent. I pointed out the possibility of student loans. Mom acknowledged it, but with conditions. That is, because they were so considerate toward me, and I had demonstrated poor judgment in the past, they would decide whether a college was worth me incurring debt. I'm uncertain how they would be able to obstruct me from obtaining loans, but I did not ask further. Scholarships were never mentioned. They completely disregarded my academic performance and did not trust in my abilities. In any case, I remained unflinching. I simply replied, "Okay," My mother did not seem to anticipate this and continued pressing for a response. Perhaps she hoped for me to have a meltdown, providing them with an excuse to refuse paying for my education. Yet I remained composed, expressing my understanding of their perspective and thanking them for their concern. That was all. My father later attempted a similar approach, but I also rebuffed his emotional manipulation. After enduring a lifetime of their abysmal parenting, I never held any expectations regarding my education. I was aware they could always concoct an excuse to avoid supporting me financially and would continue to make my life a nightmare. I had been preparing for college for a long time. My limited social outings and friendships meant I could dedicate significant time to studying, which I did, cognizant that college represented my only opportunity to attain freedom. Eventually, the moment arrived, and I exerted immense effort, securing a scholarship. It was not for any prestigious institution akin to Ivy League schools or anything as demanding as law or medical programs. However, it was a commendable course at a respectable college with a full scholarship. Knowing my sister would resent my achievement and attempt to thwart my ambitions via my parents, I announced my accomplishment on social media simultaneously as informing them. I even made it a point to thank them in the post. Now they couldn't prohibit my attendance, as they would need to justify their decision to family. Initially, they seemed somewhat proud and boasted about it. Then, my sister got wind of the news and they pivoted, questioning whether I was genuinely sure I wanted to attend. They let it slip that my sister was struggling in college, and since she was purportedly smarter and possessed better judgment than me, I might face more difficulties. I firmly stood my ground. Though they were displeased, there was nothing they could do. College became my salvation. I began to find happiness. While I continued to reach out to my parents and visited on holidays, as they refused to finance anything, I could conveniently excuse my non-attendance due to financial constraints. During this time, I carefully avoided introducing any romantic partner. My sister eventually stopped attending college. I know she never graduated because otherwise, my parents would have celebrated that achievement and moved back home, not contributing to any bills or rent, though they claimed it was a different circumstance. She then began working at the same company as my mom, obviously using my mother's influence. They presented this as a source of pride. Oh well. Almost there, I assure you. I met my husband during this period. You know those individuals who claim that, if I were in this situation, I would have acted differently. My husband embodies that person. I am the meek, compliant type who struggles to take action and agonizes over what I could have said or done differently. I find it nearly impossible to refrain from tears when I am upset. In contrast, my husband possesses a quick wit. He relishes resolving drama and is often the first to confront it. He is the type who, if he doesn't respond to a slight immediately, you better worry because he will not forgive and forget easily. Instead, he is likely contemplating something worse for retaliation. He was the one who encouraged me to share this story. He initially suggested posting it on a revenge forum, but we eventually concluded that our actions didn't warrant such a label. People were surprised that I ended up with him. Just because I struggled to act like him, likely due to my upbringing, it doesn't mean I didn't appreciate his approach. I love that my husband can do what I cannot, and he treats people well, provided they reciprocate that respect. As we discussed marriage, we determined that we didn't prioritize an extravagant ceremony due to our budget. Instead, we preferred to spend on our dream trip to Europe for the honeymoon. Regarding the wedding location, as his family was scattered and mine was still mostly in my hometown, we opted to hold it there. We lived relatively close, allowing for long weekend trips to facilitate arrangements. Plus, with some work flexibility, we could stay in my hometown if necessary. We sent out engagement announcements and saved the date notifications for a few months later. At this juncture, my parents insisted on meeting my fiancé. I wanted to muster the courage to decline, but I was struggling with the idea. The distance made me believe my parents might not be so awful. Well, my husband was visibly disheartened when I relayed the plan to at least ensure they would never be alone with him. See, he had been preparing for this encounter. He even purchased a high-quality recorder he could discreetly conceal to capture the conversation. He was excited, pondering the various ways he could fend off my sister's attempts, insult her, and then circulate the recording to my family. So off he went, eager to meet them. Upon his return, he was exhilarated. "Babe, you won't believe the outrageous demands they made. Babe, we can retaliate against them tremendously. There are so many options." I was perplexed and eager to hear the recording, but he wisely insisted it was better to hear his account first to avoid misunderstandings. He entered, and, rather than engaging in flirting, my parents and sister seated him. After some initial grumbling regarding his acceptability and my judgment, they proclaimed that they would be willing to fund my wedding, but only if my sister walked down the aisle before me, donning a wedding gown. They justified this by insisting that it was unacceptable for a younger sister to marry first, thus it was only fair for my sister to have at least the experience of it. They proposed this arrangement for my venue, complete with photographs and a cake. Now my husband would like to add his perspective. Hey, the vengeful husband here. Hell hath no fury like a pro-revenge enthusiast when his beloved is wronged. That said, though my wife portrays me as this quick-witted individual, I confess my mind practically short-circuited when they made this suggestion as if it were a remarkable gift. Even Troy would think twice about accepting that horse, I suspect. Alas, once my mind rebooted, I had a whole arsenal of insults poised to unleash, yet an inner voice urged me to lead them on. Thus, I announced that I needed time to consider, to gauge how my fiancé would react before exiting to prevent revealing my ulterior motives. Returning to my perspective as the wife, my husband recounted that my parents were so eager for my sister to overshadow my wedding with theirs, wearing a smile to accompany his narrative. He even possessed the recording as evidence. I was taken aback. The distance had skewed my perception of their treatment of me, and I mistakenly believed they wouldn't go that far. Thankfully, my husband's focus on revenge kept me from descending into a negative mindset. We thoroughly enjoyed brainstorming ways to teach them a lesson from the absurdly outrageous to the more plausible. When we settled on a plan, we called his far more rational brother. It involved creating 2 venue addresses and providing them with the incorrect one. However, my level-headed brother chastised us, acknowledging he couldn't dissuade us from pursuing retaliation while guiding us that such a plan would be difficult to execute without risk of repercussion. Ultimately, we opted for the simplest plan, pretend to agree to their demands, and then hire security to deny her entry. Naturally, if that were the extent of our scheme, it wouldn't fulfill the criteria for revenge. The remainder largely involved my husband, but he wished for me to narrate it, so here I go. It's essential to mention here that everything he did was thoughtfully discussed with me and were our shared ideas. He returned to my parents, stating he had gauged my perspective and found I would not be pleased with the situation. However, he insisted that he failed to see the problem, and not wanting the family to fracture, he was open to assisting them in orchestrating this. He mentioned that I generally dislike conflict, so if the situation surprised me, I could potentially avoid causing a scene in front of everyone. Conversely, marriage is significant, so it was uncertain whether I might lash out. He proposed a compromise they would contribute to wedding costs, thereby placing greater pressure on me to refrain from speaking out, as our families would be present, and I would be grateful for their assistance, possibly pacifying me. My husband noticed my parents appeared stunned, while my grown sister began skipping around with delight as though she were a child. Thus, they consented. Important, my husband also claimed that my past poor judgment regarding romantic partners, speaking those exact words that were my idea, for which I was genuinely proud, had rendered me distrustful and overbearing, prompting me to check his phone to ensure he was loyal. Consequently, it was imperative that none of this plan be documented in writing. For any discussions related to my sister walking down the aisle before me, he would attend to such matters at their house. And so commenced months of deception, during which my parents and sister believed they were manipulating me, while my husband and I thrived on their gullibility. How? Well, instead of merely paying for the wedding quietly, my parents sought input on every aspect. For elements that mattered significantly to me, like song selections and color schemes, my husband would encourage them to disregard my preferences to keep me compliant. However, since we were ambivalent about the ceremony itself, every other detail was fair game, or so they believed. What we orchestrated was this: we would visit to explore drink and menu options. We would select either the lowest or second lowest options. My husband would, secretly, take my sister to sample those options as well, expressing sorrow over not wishing to exploit my parents' generosity by choosing the best selections. Cue my sister demanding that my parents cover the premium choices. My parents would assure me not to worry, confirming they would cover the costs for the priciest options. The same tactic applied to photographers. For the flowers, my husband subtly handed my sister a bouquet containing my desired flowers, then expressed his regret that I preferred some unappealing flowers instead. This led my parents to insist we should go with the beautiful flowers and agree to cover the expenses. Wedding dress, we encountered a slight hurdle here. My parents insisted I wear an unattractive dress. Not ugly outright, but certainly against my style and not particularly flattering on me. We had initially planned to accept their choice and then simply not wear it, but my mother sent me a message discussing that choice, establishing proof I had agreed. We had to dig in my heels against that, and I ultimately refused in writing. My husband indicated he would see what he could do. My sister suggested sabotaging my preferred dress, compelling me to wear the other. He pretended to be on board with that notion. Throughout this time, they conducted all communications without documentation. We ensured this by having me respond whenever my sister attempted to reach him. This reinforced their perception of me as controlling and neurotic. Hence, they accepted it and avoided any correspondence in writing. Some might criticize my partner for discussing my shortcomings negatively with his family. But as a lifelong doormat, the idea of being perceived as a controlling and dangerous person is, frankly, quite humorous to me. I even encouraged him. I suppose I have a twisted sense of humor. Oh, and my sister did attempt to flirt with him, but he feigned internal conflict. To convincingly present that he was aligned with them, my husband pretended to share information without my awareness. However, he never disclosed that we had hired security. It was hilariously ironic. My husband and I initially contemplated a courthouse wedding to prioritize our honeymoon expenses, yet we were arranging a lavish, costly wedding without spending a dime of our own. We dubbed it compensation for emotional damages inflicted by my parents. I believe my husband, he just confirmed I'm correct, relished the entire ruse more than the wedding planning itself. I didn't think it possible to witness someone revel in the idea of spending an entire Saturday discussing wedding logistics with their in-laws. Yet here we are. Soon, the day arrived. The scheme my parents, sister, and husband concocted involved waiting until all guests were seated. As the bride typically makes her entrance late, my sister would arrive just at that moment, ensuring I wouldn't see her and intervene, and saunter down the aisle. By the time I discovered what had transcribed, it would be too late for me to do anything. Regarding my dress, we saved some leftover fabric from my alterations, and my husband took that to my parents' house. My sister still resides there, to showcase it as proof that he had ruined the dress. He then claimed he had to rush back to me, as I was in a state of agitation, needing to calm me down prior to attending the ceremony. We were careful to conceal our actual security personnel initially. As guests and my parents arrived, they only spotted an individual with a guest list for validation. Only after my parents took their seats did we bring forward our security, a man resembling a bodyguard. We instructed him to deny access to anyone related to my sister, promising a generous tip if he adhered to this directive. The moment arrived. My parents received a message indicating my sister was less than 5 minutes away, prompting my dad to rally everyone. The bridesmaids had been briefed to follow his cues, so they complied without consulting me. Following this, my dad assumed his position at the entrance, awaiting my arrival. During this commotion, a friend who wasn't part of the bridal party texted me to prepare. This was due to the risk that if my husband or bridesmaids started messaging, it could draw attention. This friend was in on the plan. She was a friend of my husband's, equally enthusiastic about stirring up drama, and bore no interest in being part of the wedding party. As my dad took his place, the bridal music commenced, the doors swung open, and I stepped inside. My dad gazed at me aghast. He attempted to glance behind me, but the venue entrance blocked his view of my sister's actions. Then, his phone rang. Upon recognizing the caller, I saw it was her. He simply left me there with a murmured, "Something came up." Gasps filled the space, and confusion permeated the crowd. My friend, in on the plan, called out, "What just happened?" Feigning concern, prompting me to respond tearfully that he had informed me. It wasn't supposed to be me in this place. This response was not what he actually said, but my husband and I agreed that if he deserted me, this line would portray him in the worst light possible. As for the tears, while I wish I could claim it was simply impressive acting, honestly, a part of me hadn't believed he would go that far. I thought the entire scenario was a prank. I was hurt and still am, thus I genuinely strove not to cry. My friend promptly exclaimed, "What does he mean by it shouldn't be you?" In order for as many attendees as possible to hear, then declared, "I will go check," and rushed out. We devised this tactic to keep my sister from causing chaos with security while preventing my dad from returning to interrupt the ceremony. My mother left at some point as well. At this juncture, my husband's father quickly approached and took my arm. He had been warned he might need to support me. Observing him rush to my side put a smile on my face. I made my way down the aisle among murmurs as guests speculated about what transpired. Some attendees even exited to determine the cause of the commotion. Yet, upon reaching my husband, all was well. He made me feel better with a quip that my sorrowful expression was Oscar-worthy, and I shouldn't be concerned. He would ensure my parents faced the consequences for their actions. We wed without further incident. My parents never returned. I noticed many guests departing only to return during the celebration, but none dared inform me of the situation. One individual approached my husband to whisper about the drama, prompting him to slip away. He re-entered after a while, donning a fierce demeanor while whispering to me that he needed to find a hiding spot to avoid breaking character and smiling. What transpired was a success. Here's the summarized account from friends, family, the security guard, and my husband afterward. My sister arrived in full wedding attire, but security prohibited her entry. Per our agreement, he informed her she must be at the wrong venue because there was already a bride. Yes, we tipped him generously as promised. My dad confronted him, threatening legal action, claiming he was not even aware of him, asserting he could not be employed there. The security guard merely responded affirmatively regarding the police, as he was hired by us and performing his duties. Realizing it was too late, my dad attempted to demand entry for my sister actively. At this point, my friend approached, beginning to shout and insult my sister, questioning what was happening, effectively delaying the situation. Eventually, my mom arrived, followed by additional guests. In that moment, my parents' carefully crafted plans had unraveled. All they could manage now was damage control, as those who learned about the situation were horrified by their actions, loudly criticizing them. The three of them naturally claimed it was all a secret, attempting to shift the blame onto my husband. When summoned, my husband appeared, displaying the most bewildered demeanor, denying any involvement in the plot. To quote him, "Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss?" He refuted ever agreeing to such a ludicrous idea. When they insisted otherwise, he demanded evidence naturally. They were unable to provide any. All the text exchanges they presented pertained to standard wedding topics. At this point, my sister was in tears, kicking her legs like a child on the ground. My dad appeared ready to physically confront my husband, but security and other attendees restrained him. Of course, my parents claimed they had no proof to substantiate their accusations, as my husband had directed them to avoid documentation. He laughed, commenting on the uncanny convenience of that situation. He tore into them about their appalling parenting, before asserting he would not allow their foolish schemes to hinder his wedding and return to my side. Nobody believed them. The venue had surveillance cameras, but they declined to share any footage, claiming it was solely for security purposes. However, some guests recorded snippets. Witnessing my parents and sister being scrutinized by relatives who apprehended the drama was delectable. After enduring years of being disbelieved and accused, experiencing their turn of events was among the best wedding gifts imaginable. My mother was in tears, while my father fluctuated between red and pale, and my sister remained on the floor crying. They repeatedly insisted that my husband was involved, but guests interrogated why he would agree, why there was no corroboration, and why they wanted my sister to undermine my wedding. They lacked satisfying answers. Eventually, guests instructed them to leave, and they had no choice but to comply. My father had to physically lift my sister from the ground when she refused to depart. Throughout the evening, guests maintained discretion around me, Perhaps they wished to shield me, or maybe, given I was the bride rather than just another guest, everyone seemed extra considerate, enthusiastic, and joyful throughout the occasion. My husband joked that all the extravagant items they indulged in certainly added to the celebratory atmosphere. We reveled in the festivities. My husband sustained his feigned anger for only a brief time before breaking into genuine smiling. Afterward, we retired to our hotel to rest before embarking on our honeymoon. Speaking of honeymoons, my parents attempted to finance our plane tickets, but we deemed that too risky, suspecting they might attempt to cancel them, so we refused the offer. Naturally, since that event, the three individuals have tried to reach me. I have ignored their calls because my husband insisted on establishing a documented record. This was prudent, as my sister eventually messaged me. While I won't share the full content, it was quite deranged and nonsensical, the key takeaway being that she blamed me for her humiliation, labeled my husband as a deceitful snake who had tricked them for months. He found that amusing. He wants to print it for display in our home, and expressed her hope, while also firmly believing, that I would face infidelity in my marriage. She suggested directly that my husband was unfaithful with her. My husband took control of my phone, capturing screenshots of call logs, my sister's message, and my parents' demands for communication, subsequently dispatching all of it to our family group chat. Alongside the screenshots of threats directed at him, he maintained the "you're delusional" stance, even threatening to sue them for harassment. He composed a message in the group chat imploring my family for assistance, as I was presently enduring consistent harassment from them. He requested that they ensure our locations remained undisclosed to prevent my parents from dispatching my sister to accuse him of organizing a rendezvous during our honeymoon. My family promised to handle the matter. And indeed, since that point, we have experienced silence. My husband expresses disappointment that my sister wasn't daring enough to defy expectations so he could expose her while reprimanding her. We'll see if this tranquility continues. In summary, while I would have preferred a typical, loving family at my wedding, at least, for once in my life, they not only failed to sabotage something significant to me, but also received a taste of their own medicine.